Okay. So as we left off with, and we ended up on Monday when between Ellis and Dory, I'm sure y'all were like, dear God, he lives in a zoo. We were finishing up talking about sort of the areas and the things that are going to all signal into the medulla, to the respiratory centers in the medulla that help to regulate your breathing, right? And so you have the respiratory centers, the things in the hypothalamus. The respiratory centers, in many ways, will function very much like the SA node in the heart. Okay. You guys never have to think about breathing when you're just here at rest, right? It's very passive, but it just happens. 6 to 10 times per minute at rest for most people. Okay. So you have those things. Hypothalamus, medulla, pons, they control the motor neurons that innervate the diaphragm. You can overcome those if you want to hold your breath, but in general, there's this sort of rhythmic SA node-like periodic signals that are going to come from there. We have voluntary signals from the motor cortex into the medulla. So if I say, hold your breath, you stop contracting. If I say, essentially hyperventilate, okay, should we make somebody pass out in class? We used to do ridiculously dumb things when we were bored at baseball practice when I was in high school. Because baseball practice was too long and there's only so much you could do while you were shagging fly balls. And basically, if you put your head down like this and take like 20 really deep breaths, then stand up really quickly and go and squish your carotid arteries, you will pass right out. Okay. And part of that is, okay, is going to be in response to what's happening with these chemoreceptors when we provide this, and we essentially hyperventilate, we blow off extra CO2, and it makes your PaO2 drop and these kinds of things. And so then when you change posture, things get real bad. Okay. But we sense carbon dioxide, okay, in the carotid arteries and in the aortic arch. So we're sensing CO2 in arterial blood, where it's normally very low. Okay. So what is happening that controls breathing is as CO2 builds up in venous blood, in response to increase in metabolic demand or increase in metabolism, then there's going to be some small percentage of it that we don't clear out in our exchange at the lungs. And so it's going to rise ever so slightly in aortic concentrations and in carotid concentrations, and then in the interstitial fluid that makes it up into the medulla. And so because of that, that is going to stimulate the respiratory centers, increase breathing frequency and increase breathing depth, in the hope that then when we will blow off more CO2 from that venous blood coming back to our lungs. Okay. Does that make sense, guys? I've always found that, again, to be kind of a backwards thing. You think all the CO2 builds up in venous blood, and that's what makes it to the lungs. Why isn't it there? It's actually going to be on the arterial side where the receptors are. Okay. And so it's very, very sensitive to very, very small changes in CO2 levels. And it can actually, in some ways, also be very, very linked to blood pressure and some stuff that goes on. Okay. There are stretch receptors, as we talked about, in your lungs. And then there's muscle and joint receptors. Much like heart rate increases as you think about exercising, or as you start like just moving your arm. Even if I have you guys stand up, you will get signals from proprioceptors in your joints. You get signals from muscle spindles that will also see an immediate increase in breathing. Okay. All right. No, maybe it's thinking about letting me go on. Okay, we talked about this. We talked about what pulmonary ventilation is, how this is related to the sort of pulmonary analog to cardiac output. But I want to show you guys in this context, we say that it goes up during exercise and it goes up in direct proportion to CO2 production. Then it's going to actually increase in two phases. Okay, it's going to increase in two phases. And there's a slide. The next slide shows this, but I also sometimes find that it's easier if I draw it out. Okay. So what happens is at rest, right, you've got some frequency, some ventilation amount here. 10 breaths per minute, 8 breaths per minute at 2 liters per breath or whatever it's going to be. You've got some number, okay? As you start to exercise, as you stand up and you start to walk, there is going to be this very, very rapid increase that looks like this, okay? This is what we would call phase 1 changes in breathing, okay? This is, for the most part, entirely produced by body movement, by proprioceptors and muscle spindles, okay? This is prepping us for we're about to exercise, okay? Phase 2 is after we get this increase, there may be a little bit more gradual increase that's going to be here, okay? Before we level everything out. Phase 2 changes is more gradual, it is slower, and it's going to be much more driven by changes in carbon dioxide levels in arterial blood that are the result of increased aerobic metabolism. Okay. There's also a little bit of input from hydrogen, but it's mostly CO2. So we do this, and if exercise is reasonably tolerable, you're going to reach out here. You're going to reach, just like with heart rate or cardiac output, you're going to reach a steady state where it stays basically the same as long as work rate stays the same. Okay. And then you stop exercising and there's this more gradual return down on the back end. Okay. Let me see if this actually works. Okay. And the green is force production from the muscles, or this is what we're doing when you're beginning to exercise, right? So I've gone from, I'm resting, I immediately increase metabolic cost. I start walking at a constant rate, walk, stop, right? And it's going to go right back down. So you can see again, a little bit of this kind of lag in breathing and this lag at the end, right? That looks a lot like the changes in oxygen consumption. Okay. Now, this is going to be sort of more pronounced during like jogging or moderate intensity exercise, and then during what we would call heavy intensity, or really we should call it, nowadays we should call it severe intensity exercise that is well above lactate threshold. You will note that as it gets higher and higher, you may not entirely be able to reach steady state. There's this rapid phase 1 increase, and then this little bit of gradual kind of right at the end. There's more here. Stop, and then it drags on its way back down. Okay. And so what the right panel here is showing is in the yellow, this is alveolar oxygen. This is, if we look at how much O2 is in the air we breathe in, very high, very much constant. Okay. If you look at here in the gold, that's alveolar PCO2, so the partial pressure of CO2. So you've got this relatively constant amount of CO2 that we're breathing out. But then if you look at mixed venous PCO2, so this is if I just do venipuncture and I look in here, you'll note here's this kind of rise in venous CO2. And they've not graphed on here what would happen, but there's also going to be a slight corresponding increase and then a leveling off if we look at arterial CO2 levels. Okay, so it's this increase in CO2 here that's mostly driving a lot of that increase in breathing. Okay. Okay. So let's talk about a couple of breathing irregularities. If you guys ever do things with clinical populations, this is the stuff you're going to encounter. One of them is called dyspnea, which is one of my least favorite words to ever have to try to say. Dyspnea is shortness of breath. Okay. I cannot catch my breath. It is very often caused by an inability to adequately adjust to CO2 increases and hydrogen ion increases. Okay. In lots of untrained clinical populations, people that are post-heart attack, people that have some kind of pulmonary disorder, they do not adjust well to these changes. And so they have a hard time breathing correctly or at the correct rate to match and clear that CO2. Very, very often this is related to poor conditioning of the diaphragm. Okay, so you see it in older folks and deconditioned folks much more often than we do you guys. Hyperventilation is another irregularity. This is in essence overbreathing. When you voluntarily hyperventilate, it can reduce ventilatory drive by decreasing CO2 and hydrogen in the blood. Anybody has ever tried to hold your breath for a very long time? Or you see those folks that do the crazy stuff where they like free dive and they'll try to go down, you know, like hundreds of meters, which seems just fucking crazy and stupid to me, but you know, to each their own, right? To each their own. They will hyperventilate on purpose. So you go blow off extra CO2, lower your arterial CO2 concentrations, then start holding your breath. So it knocks that level down. So it's got to rise, got more room for it to rise before it's going to trigger that kind of impulse to breathe from the respiratory. Okay. That allows for better breath holding. But other times people will actually hyperventilate. They will overbreathe for some different things. We also then call Valsalva. We call that a breathing irregularity. I mean, it's really not an irregularity. It is breath holding, right? It is breath holding combined with contracting the diaphragm and these things, trapping air, raising pressure, so that when we move heavy objects or we move and we squish ourselves around, we're not going to damage internal organs very, very often. Okay. All right. So to finish off, we're going to talk about a somewhat complicated thing, and I'm actually going to skip over the ventilatory equivalent. We're going to come back to it, okay? Because what I'm going to talk about is there is something called the ventilatory breakpoint, okay? Remember that we store carbon dioxide in our blood as bicarbonate. So if I make a graph that looks like this, okay, and I graph, let's just say, oxygen consumption, okay? There's VO2. This is work rate, running, walking, biking, whatever, right? So as work rate increases, aerobic metabolism increases, oxygen consumption increases correspondingly, okay? If we graph ventilation or breathing on this same graph in response to the same increase in work, it does a somewhat strange thing. It goes up, 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 and then we get to a place and it actually shifts, okay? And this point right here is, we sometimes abbreviate it as T-vent, but it really is, this is the ventilatory breakpoint, okay? And so I'm going to try to explain to you guys what's happening here. And then we'll go back and talk about the ventilatory equivalent of oxygen and how that can help us identify this, okay? So you all have bicarbonate in your blood. So there's CO2 floating around in your blood as bicarbonate. You essentially have Tums dissolved in your blood, which is a good thing. As exercise intensity increases, we clear lactate threshold. And so we start having more and more hydrogen that gets into venous blood. Okay. As those hydrogen levels begin to rise, they will bind with the bicarbonate, and then we will push the CO2 out of bicarbonate, and you'll have CO2 and water. Okay. And we will neutralize that hydrogen. We will neutralize that acidity by doing all of this. And so what we get, though, as a consequence is we are getting carbon dioxide that shows up at the lungs and then subsequently can make it over into arterial blood that does not come from the Krebs cycle. It does not come from aerobic metabolism. Okay? All the other CO2 we make is made in the Krebs cycle. Okay? And so as that happens, you're still making CO2 from the Krebs cycle, but now we start getting extra CO2 that comes from buffering that acidity. Okay. And so if we make more CO2, that's going to drive breathing to go up higher, higher. And so if I was to put on here, what likely happens is right about here, okay, this is going to be lactate threshold. So we get over lactate threshold, we make hydrogen, it starts getting buffered, so we start making extra CO2. As exercise continues, we're going to continuing increase in CO2 from aerobic metabolism, plus more and more CO2 from the continued increase in hydrogen coming out of glycolysis and lactic acid, which gets buffered. And so that then drives the steeper increase in breathing. Okay. So if I have you do a test and I have you hooked up to a metabolic cart and I gradually increase your work rate, I don't have to measure blood lactate. I can just watch for your breathing change, okay, by graphing out your breathing, and I can guess pretty closely at about where your lactate threshold, all by watching breathing, okay? And so one of the ways that we can do that is by looking at a graph like that. Another way that we can do it is by looking at something or a graph of something called the ventilatory equivalent of oxygen and the ventilatory equivalent of carbon dioxide. Okay. This graph here is meant basically to be what I drew over there. You will note the green line is ventilation, it's up and it breaks, right? And then they just not lined their axes up so the lines are on top of each other. That's what I drew over there. What this is showing is the ventilatory equivalent is you take ventilation and you divide it by either VCO2 or you take ventilation and you divide it by VO2. So you're essentially getting a ratio of for how much oxygen I'm consuming, how much am I breathing? For how much CO2 is being produced, how much am I breathing? Okay. And what happens is the ventilatory equivalent of CO2, because the CO2 is the primary controller of breathing, stays pretty flat at all exercise intensity. It's relatively flat. Okay. But if we look at the ventilatory equivalent of oxygen, breathing divided by CO2, at ventilatory breakpoint, it's going to start to increase because breathing is beginning to go up at a faster rate than oxygen consumption is going. And so what we would do if we want to identify this is we make this graph and we check this point, and then we graph these and we lay them over the top of it, and we check and see if there's a corresponding increase here, and that helps us identify what's going on. Okay, that helps us identify what's going on. And so these are actual data from individuals, okay? And I think when you look at it this way, you can see here's VCO2 graphed against VO2. You've got sort of below lactate threshold, there's this very linear increase. And then it's linear, but it's at a different slope and it breaks right here. And then here's the same thing where they're graphing lactate levels against ventilatory threshold. And so you project out, right, like there's a linear part here. When we get slightly over lactate threshold and it breaks, it goes up like that. Okay, so that's the idea of buffering and how it controls breathing. Your textbook calls this isocapnic buffering. It's using breathing and CO2 to help us do those kinds of. Okay, we'll stop with respiratory or pulmonary limits on exercise performance. Okay, can respiration or can your ability to ventilate especially limit exercise performance? And the answer is maybe, right? Maybe. Under some circumstances, the answer is yes. Under most circumstances in young, healthy people, the answer is no. It is very rarely a limiting factor except in highly trained people. Okay. Probably just about every one of you in class, if I gave you more red blood cells, I can make your VO2 max go up today, immediately. Okay, so we do a max test. We find out what your ventilation is at VO2 max. Then I give you a pint of red blood cells. I make your blood volume go up. I make your O2 carrying capacity go up. Your VO2 max goes up, and magically your max ventilation goes up. Okay, and what that tells us is that most of you, right, can ventilate to a greater degree than your muscles can use to consume oxygen right now. It is not the limiting factor in most of you right now, because if we do something that increases your capacity, it immediately goes up. And having more red blood cells has no impact on pulmonary function. Ventilatory muscles are very fatigue resistant. Your diaphragm is likely it's the slowest muscle in your body. It's the most fatigue resistant. That's good because you've been breathing for a long time. Diffusion or perfusion of the alveoli may become a limiting factor in some folks. Okay. Our ability to actually move gases into and out of the pulmonary capillaries, that may, at very high intensities, that may be a limiting factor. Okay. There are certain diseases that cause abnormal respiration. You can have what is called a restrictive pulmonary disorder, or you can have an obstructive pulmonary disorder. In each one of those, a restrictive one means you can't basically open your lungs up as much as you want, right? Think of restrictive as someone is sitting on your chest. You can't open your chest cavity up, so you can't breathe, right? Weirdly, obesity could be considered a restrictive pulmonary disorder. Or you can have an obstructive one, which is like asthma, where I've scrunched down those bronchioles and there are in essence obstructions in the airway, so I can't breathe as much air. Those can definitely limit performance. And lots and lots and lots of older individuals that have cardiovascular disease also will have pulmonary disorders. People that have been smokers and have emphysema, people that have COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, that will happen. The other place there may be a ventilatory limitation or perfusion or diffusion limitation is at altitude. If you go to high altitudes, we shrink those pressure gradients. There's basically like half as much air at the top of Mount Everest as there is here, right? There's a reason that half of the people that try to climb Mount Everest die, right? Again, I'm good. I don't need to test my limits that much. I'm fine. I go for a run, right? So I can find a place where it's not that high, not that kind of weather, but you shrink those gradients, right? So the partial pressure as there is less air pressure falls. It's not 760 anymore. It's 350. And there's still 20% oxygen in the air, or 21%, but you've essentially lowered that partial pressure by half. And so now that gradient between the air in the alveoli and what's going on at the hemoglobin, we've shrunk that gradient way, way, way down. And now we're going to get less O2 that will bind on to hemoglobin. And you go high enough and it becomes a real problem. Okay? All right. Thus, into my least favorite thing to talk about in the entire class, and that's the pulmonary system. I just find it very uninteresting because for the most part, you exercise train, nothing happens. You don't train your lungs, you don't grow new lungs, nothing happens, right? They function pretty well in most people. They're just kind of boring. I find them to be pretty boring. So anyway, there we have it, all right? Okay, we've got about 22 minutes or thereabouts. I'm happy to try to answer questions or review for the test on Friday. Format will be just like it has been. Okay, it'll be just like it has been. There'll be, I don't know, 30 or 35 multiple choice questions and 3 or 4 or 5 of those short answer ones that are going to come from the list. And that's what we're doing. Okay. So, who has questions? Literally no.
The question on the outline that says how much energy comes from plasma glucose, plasma FFA, muscle glycogen.
Yes.
I can't find in the slides.
Okay, I just didn't get that taken off. That's a metabolism question, so don't worry about that. Although, in theory, right, there's a graph that roughly depicts that in the VO2 and fatigue thing. And what I want you guys to know essentially is that as duration increases, fat use goes up, carb use goes down. As intensity increases, carb use goes up, fat use goes down. They're sort of opposite of each other. That's the general. You have to know, like, okay, well, you are metabolizing, this many millimoles of glucose or something. Okay. Should I take from the lack of questions that we have not begun to study? Yeah. Emily.
The graphs about heart rate and like all that stuff. for
Yes.
Exercise, do we have to like know specifics or just kind of like the x-axis and y-axis labels and like the.
That, right, that. So you don't have to know, like, heart rates. I mean, you could figure it out probably, that like heart rate's gonna go to 200 beats per minute at max in a 20-year-old individual. But I want you to know, right, as we start to exercise, heart rate's gonna go up and it's gonna be sort of directly kind of linear with oxygen consumption. Stroke volume goes up and then it levels off, and cardiac output kind of goes up, in a very linear way as well. So know the axes and know relatively what the curves are doing and what they tell us, but they're not going to be specific like numbers on all. Right.
For the heart rate max equation, do we just have to know the
220 minus age. Dear God, we're not using the other. 207 and 8/10 minus your age divided by 90%, and you end up with like 1 beat per minute difference max heart rate. So just know 220 minus age. Okay, just 220 minus age.
For the short answers, number 8, where it's saying when you're suspended upside down.
Ah!
And in your posture, but the volume doesn't change.
Yep. That's the question, isn't it? Oh, my grad students love that question. Okay. Anybody want to come do a handstand for us? He says, well, conspicuously not looking at the gymnast in the class, right? Anybody? We've been trying to teach Alice how to do a handstand. And she's about to kill herself trying to do a handstand. So clearly by like almost age 6, we know she's not going to be Simone Biles. So she's not great. She cannot do a cartwheel. It kills me. She's really good on the balance beam, and she's really strong on the bars and can do things, but she cannot like figure out how to do a cartwheel. Anyway, if you do a handstand, so if I strung you up by your feet, it's all about gravity, right? It's all about gravity. Where is gravity trying to pull the blood if you were flipped upside down? Okay, so if we made all of you in here do a handstand, what would happen to preload? What would happen to venous return and to preload based upon gravity? It's going to increase. Okay, so you can make an argument that at rest, if you change posture and you go head down, right, we might see an increase in stroke volume and a corresponding decrease in heart rate at rest, right? Because you get the same cardiac output out of fewer beats per minute because stroke volume has gone up because gravity is pulling venous blood back into the left ventricle. Right? That seems very reasonable. But we have a problem. Okay, it's the same problem that you have if you were trying to ride the bike upside down. Okay. What might happen that could counteract all of that? It's also due to gravity.
The blood's harder to go back out.
The blood is harder to go back out. Why is it harder to go back out there?
Gravity.
Gravity. What would we call the difficulty of the blood going out? Afterload. Okay. So essentially what happens is preload goes up And then afterload also goes up. And they counteract each other. Okay? What is the shape of your aorta? What does the aorta look like? So if I go and I flip and I put my feet up, where does most of the blood, arterial blood in my body have to go? It comes out of the aorta, which that's a good start, but then the aorta turns, and where does it have to go then? Got to go to my head, but how's it going to get to my feet? Or my legs? I'm riding a bike upside down. How's it going to get to my quads? Yes, but what happens to those pressure gradients? Nothing? What's gravity doing? Gravity's trying to pull the blood down. As I stand here, where is gravity pulling blood in my body? Down to my legs. So if I flip and I do the other, okay, now what's gravity doing? It's trying to pull it back down towards my head, right? So I have to overcome gravity rather than getting an assist from gravity to move blood to those exercising appendages. And what happens then is that ejection fraction falls, afterload goes up, and it counteracts the increase in preload that we get. Now, as far as I know, and I will not ask you guys that question. I'm not gonna ask you all. Okay, but it's a fun question to try to illustrate. I ask all of them when I would teach the master's students, I would ask them that question. And I've had two of them who you guys have probably had in class that have spent 3 years trying to find, they thought I said there was a paper where somebody flipped people upside down and actually had them ride a bike, okay, and measured cardiac output in those things. And they were like, they said the other day, well, we can't ever find that paper. And I'm like, that's because there's not a paper, right? It's based upon, there are papers when people go into space and there's no gravity, then certain things happen. And so you can sort of extrapolate in that way. So if anybody wants to exercise upside down, you can help me like build a big frame and we'll bolt our bike into it and we'll get a harness and then we'll harness you in and you can come try to ride upside down in the lab. IRB wouldn't let us do it because you get a lot of blood, increases in blood pressure into the brain, and it would increase blood clots and stroke risk and all of that. So it wouldn't let us. Okay.
I have a question on that.
Okay.
So if you were to exercise upside down,
Yes.
whenever we exercise, blood diverts from the organs and stuff that aren't being used towards the muscles.
Yes.
So if it was diverting from the brain towards the, like if we're biking, it would go to the leg muscles. Would that not have an effect?
So we're going to maintain relatively stable cerebral blood flow no matter what it is that we're doing. Whether you're upside down, whether you're right side up, whether you're going hard or walking, pretty much at almost all costs, we will maintain cerebral flow. So it's an interesting idea, but probably not going to have a lot of effect. What else? Nothing. Seriously? Pardon? Okay. Well, then want to go? I'll hang out for 10 minutes. Y'all can ask more questions if you want. If not, I'll try to be here by about 8:30 on Friday. So you guys can start early again. I'll see if I can remember to print off some signs to put on the door. It says we're taking a test. Everybody stay out until we're done. Okay. I'll get the videos uploaded today and we'll be good to go.